Thank you.
Okay, all right. So, hello everyone. So I'll start sharing my screen so that we can have a clear understanding of. Okay, all right. So today, what we are going to discuss about is impacting arguments and effective use of examples. So the way that I would want to structure this particular session is talk quite a bit with regard to how I have come across this impacts of arguments. Is something that has been talked about to a certain degree at some point of time, but hasn't really been given a lot of emphasis. And that is the reason why I sort of, when she reached told me about this session, I thought of coming up with, and please, it's a disclaimer that all the contents and material that I will be discussing, experience that I have gathered over time, being associated with debate for a few years. To the impacts first. So we'll be talking about in terms of questions. So this what I've always realized is if we try and discuss in question format, it actually helps us. Okay. So what essentially is impact of an argument? Normally, whenever we talk about an argument, we say that we give the claim that we have that okay, this is going to bring about this change. This is going to have this impact. This is going to make effect in the lives of people in this way. We often at times do not really explain the impact. It sort of hampers the way we want to put forward the ideas that we have. So in order to ensure that the impact that we're explaining, that sort of helps us to further our cause to explain what we are trying to put forward. So impact essentially is how a particular action is going to have an outcome, or what would be the result of something being done. That is what we normally identify as an impact. Why do we need to consider the impact of a claim that we're making in an argument? So an argument often at times is, or there would be certain economical changes, or let's say the economy of a country is going to be affected. But if we do not explain the effect that is taking place, or we do not show the likelihood of the change to take place, then often at times the effect on an adjudicator that often at times is not to the degree or extent that we would actually want. I will definitely be able to explain further whenever all of you would probably have any questions in the Q&A session or the Q&A part of this particular session. So the reason why we need to consider the impacts is because it helps us to complement the argument and also give a more approachable extent or degree of effect on the adjudicator to convince or to persuade the judges in front of us that okay, this is why and how we can actually show that the effect that we are claiming it is likely to happen and be there as well. What is likely to happen when we do not show, when we're not showing the impacts of a claim? What it essentially ends up doing is the degree to which an adjudicator can relate with the idea, or let's say an adjudicator can actually go forward and understand the idea, that reduces or that decreases. And we don't want that. We want to ensure that whatever ideas we're explaining that has adequate effect on the adjudicator, and that is definitely enhanced if we are showcasing or indicating the impact of the claim that we are making. All right. So how can we explain this? Let's look at a motion. This house would force all universities to make their courses free and available online. So I'll be explaining it through this particular motion as an example. Now, this is essentially a policy motion. What is a policy motion? That means you have to take a step. This house would force all universities. So you are trying to suggest that you need this action to be taken. And when this action is taken, there would definitely be certain outcomes. There would definitely be certain results that would happen. And whenever you're explaining these results or whenever you're explaining this outcome, it is particularly important for us to show a few things. What are they? First is, why do we need to do this? The need and necessity portion. Second is how the intended objectives that we want to achieve by making this happen, why are these likely? Let me give you a better explanation of this. Let's say you want to improve or enhance the accessibility of education. So the normal basic way of approaching a debate, that the problem that we see in the status quo is how not everyone is having adequate access to quality education. There is a disparity between the quality of education provided by different universities. So in order to sort of standardize, or let's say making sure that the access to education or learning material is of a certain standard, or let's say there's a certain degree of standardization that happens, we need this action to be taken. Here, how does impact come into consideration? What we need to realize is by taking these steps, that these would force all universities to make their courses free and available online. What changes are we making? Here, the description of the changes is not that essential. Why? Because the wording of the motion or the resolution is very straightforward, that you have to force whom all universities to do what? To make their courses free and available online. By taking these steps or by making this happen, how are you impacting the different stakeholders? This is where the stakeholders come in. You are talking about the universities, because universities have a huge stake because they are investing, they have their faculties, they have their infrastructure built. How are they affected? How are they impacted? How are the students affected? Because here there has to be a mutual gain for the universities who are providing the education and the students who are sort of are being benefited from the education that they are acquiring or they are receiving from the respective universities as well. By taking a step as such or by taking an initiative as such, how are you making changes for the universities? How are you making changes for the students? The explanation of the changes would essentially be your impacts. That how are you impacting the life of a student? Are you giving him or her a better opportunity to learn? Are you providing these individuals better learning, platform, or let's say better quality of learning materials available to these people? How would it change their way of going about? How would it help them to make their lives better? How would you affect them economically? Let's say they can now have better skill sets at their disposal, and this is going to allow them to have better working opportunities, or this is going to help them have better job prospects. This explanation is often at times not given as much focus, and this is the reason why I feel that impacts come into consideration for us. That when you are able to showcase to the adjudicator that, okay, by making these courses free and online, we think we will be able to provide further access to the students, which will eventually lead towards them getting better quality of education, which would then result in them being, more competent, making them having, or let's say, allow them to have better scope of learning available, which would help them to be more equipped and have better skill sets that would help them to be nurtured and contribute in the economy. So this impact on the economy, or this impact in the society, because they would now be more learned, they would be more informed, they can have better understanding at their disposal of the different ideas that perhaps they were unable to understand beforehand. So under these circumstances, why and how these are beneficial. If you're in the opposition, making these courses free and available, how would they be implicating negatively? Is there enough motivation and incentive for universities to invest heavily? Because we all understand how much these universities are spending money. How are they spending money? They're spending money by employing better quality professors, by employing better faculty members, by providing good quality of infrastructure. Do we still incentivize these universities to provide these courses? And again, free and available. So you have to ensure that the cost is reduced. You have to ensure that it is accessible by greater majority. So from the opposition or the negative side, we would have to try and justify. Again, if you look at here, this is a good example for us to understand how these impacts, if you're able to describe them, if you're able to focus on them and emphasize on them, it definitely helps your cause to make the adjudicator understand that this is something that would definitely be persuasive and compelling to the adjudicators. All right. So this was the example of how impacts can be utilized and optimized in a motion as such. Whenever we'll be going back to the Q&A, you are more than welcome to refer back to any of the explanation that I have provided. I'll be more than happy to explain it. So this sort of covered the impact portion of this particular session. Now, in order to showcase the impact, okay, if you saw here, examples are essentially critical because they help you to form or create a bridge between the claim that you have and the explanation that you want to provide, and for the judges or the judge to understand. So examples essentially often at times they become the premise of the argument. So here you need to sort of strike a balance. What do I mean by this? Often at times when we are thinking of arguments, examples come to your mind that, okay, we want to show dictators are bad. Okay, these are bad dictators. All right, let's give examples. And on the basis of the examples, we showcase, okay, fine, here the individual was really bad. Thus, we can make a claim that, okay, these are bad dictators, so dictatorship is bad. Or these are good dictators, thus dictators or dictatorship isn't really as bad. So we often at times base our arguments on examples. And what it does is it often at times sort of shifts the focus from the explanation part. And when that happens, what it essentially ends up doing is it does not really credit the actual essence of the example that it tries to portray. What do I mean by this? Whenever an argument is being explained, you need to recognize that if you do not have an adequate balance of the explanation that you have in mind and the example that you're providing, then you will not be able to convince the adjudicator. Okay, so we need to have this certain balance. Without examples, often at times it is difficult to understand why and how the argument that you're saying is relatable. Why do we need examples? Visual, perhaps intent to achieve, or let's say what would prefer a world where lying is not possible. So if you give example that, okay, through it might be hypothetical example, it can be a real life example. Both are possible. Whatever sort of enables you to reach out to the adjudicator, and that the examples are appropriate and the examples are definitely suitable for the crowd that you're trying to reach out to. Okay, another problem that I've often observed is examples should be as much global as possible. What do I specifically mean by this? You belonging from a certain background would have exposure. For example, I belong from Bangladesh, so now I have moved to Canada. So in Canadian circuit, if I try to give the examples that are more or less highly prominent in developing world, it is going to be difficult for those ideas to be, you know, presented properly without the examples being presented. So the examples essentially help the judges to relate with the ideas that you're trying to explain here. So examples help you to portray the ideas in a more understandable manner. So we need examples for the judges to be able to relate with the idea that you're trying to explain. And as I said, we often at times assume that since I know an example, which perhaps is more common to me because I belong from a developing country, might not be as easily relatable for someone who might not be from a background of, let's say, developing countries. So in those circumstances, it becomes absolutely imperative for us as debaters to make sure that these examples are tailored or these examples are explained in a manner that is understandable for a global audience. So please do not restrict yourself with examples that are more polarized to your background, or let's say the environment that you are more familiar and accustomed with. Yes, there are certain more global understanding. What do I mean by this? Let's say the understanding of poverty or the understanding of lying per se. These are more universal, but there are certain examples that we often at times bring about that you might be very easily understand or connect with, but that might not be the case with the adjudicator in front of you. So please kindly bear this in mind whenever you are going with your debates. So the need for examples is to make the judge relate with what you're trying to explain. What is likely to happen when we do not provide examples? It goes back to the impact. When your examples are not relatable, it ends up making the judge not thoroughly convinced or compelled with the ideas that you're presenting, and it hampers the overall effect that the argument has on the judges. So if you do not provide examples, the judge might not be able to connect or relate with the ideas that you're explaining. So it sort of ends up reducing the effect on the judges, and we don't want that. We want our arguments to have adequate effect on the judges, and examples definitely would help to enhance that and further that cause of yours. Sample motion. This was regrets the rise of social media, a very common motion that we have often at times, I have at least come across. So by regretting the rise of social media, we need to explain a lot that, okay, how has the social media impacted the society? How has the social media impacted the economy? How has the social media impacted the behavior of people? Whenever you are making claims as such that, okay, it has affected negatively or it has affected positively, these claims can only be sort of explained properly, or let's say can explain clearly, when you have provided the appropriate examples. If you do not provide the examples that what you're trying to mean here, the possibility for an adjudicator to connect with what you're trying to present here or connect with what you're trying to explain here, that essentially decreases. Okay, so what we need to understand here is, whenever we say the economy of a country, or let's say the economy is impacted or affected due to social media, give examples. And again, as I said, the examples should not be only exclusive to your background or your country, not like try to provide as much of global examples, or let's say examples that are more prominently familiar. Okay, I think all of you are well aware that for an adjudicator, it is assumed that the adjudicator in front of you is an average reasonable individual who has certain degree of understanding of what is happening around the world. Okay, so whenever you are giving these examples, make sure that these examples are somewhat relatable to an individual who follows the news at an average rate, not someone who knows extensive details, but is someone who sort of tries to follow through what is happening around the world and can go about accordingly. Because what I've often also at times observed is, especially for prepared motions at different competitions, especially at school level, not at universities per se, that whenever the prepared motions are sort of taken into consideration, the students try to narrow the motion in their favor. Yes, you have the opportunity to do that, but we still need to make sure that the examples that we're providing are definitely relatable by individuals from different background, and this background can be in multiple fold. What do I mean by this? They can be from different country background, they can be from different religious background, they can be from different academic background as well. So let's say if you're trying to explain the economical impacts and effects, which is perhaps understandable to a student of economics major, is not really a good way to go. We try to ensure that the samples or examples that we're providing, they are easily relatable for someone who might belong from different backgrounds. Your arguments or your examples should not be specific to backgrounds of individuals who are specialists in these areas. Okay, for example, the law motions. Often at times I've seen that law students tend to give a lot of explanation that are very law academic background or academic knowledge focused. What it ends up doing is it does not give adequate opportunity for an adjudicator to connect and relate with your ideas. And whenever that happens, it becomes less convincing. For any debate to be, argued with adequate explanation or adequate emphasis, I think it becomes really essential that we understand that, okay, we want to explain how our claims are going to affect, how our claims are going to make these people understand what we are trying to portray in front of them. And this is where the suitability of the examples come in. Whenever we are preparing our arguments, let's say the preparation time that you have at your disposal, that 15 minutes or that 30 minutes or that 1 hour for WSDC, it is important that within that timeline, we prioritize the impacts that what is this essentially going to have as an outcome, why the outcome is likely to happen. Because if we do not we just say, okay, we think this will happen, but don't really show that why is it likely to happen, or what are the reasons for us to sort of make a claim that yes, this is more or less likely to happen, you will not be able to convince the judges, right? In terms of examples as well, as I said, that until and unless the examples are relatable, until and unless the examples are understandable for the judge, because we need to recognize that examples are essentially helpful for you to make sure that the judge gets to relate with your idea. The explanation that you're making, it is supposed to be complemented by your example. If you base your entire argument on example, that is doable, but at like my personal experiences, it might not work out, you know, in a certain way all the time. It happened to me as well, where I had an example and then I sort of based an entire argument on it, and it did not really fly through, and did not convince the judges as much as I would have wanted it to do so. So in order to avoid these sort of circumstances, uh, you can definitely learn along more with examples. And as I said, you can give personalized or examples as well. But then again, the personalized examples that, okay, in my family this certain thing happened, they should not be, absolute outliers. They should not be so out of the spectrum that the judges or the opponent teams are simply not able to relate. Okay, because those exclusive arguments might not be able to convince the general populace. So whenever you are considering an example, it is absolutely necessary that you try to understand and analyze the greater majority of the audience being able to relate with it, specifically the judges. All right. So that's sort of, I wanted to make this entire session quite short because I would want to focus on any specific question that there might be on examples. So
In debates when two teams start clashing on the example and not the principal core argument that the team is trying to put forward. So how do you deal it? How do you deal with this as a speaker as an adj? Do you count that example or? So I had a question related to when two teams don't carry forward the principal argument but start debating upon the example instead.
okay, so when this happens, it is a bad approach because examples essentially do not really help you to convince an adjudicator. The authenticity of the example at times, if they're debating on that, then it's just not a good approach because the main focus for any team or for any debater or any adjudicator is to evaluate the merit or the persuasiveness of the idea that is being debated here. Okay, the example is secondary. The example essentially helps the teams to make the judge relate with the idea that the teams are trying to explain here. And for an adjudicator, I do not think that an adjudicator is required to give much of a focus, or let's say a much of an emphasis on the examples that are being contested. If that is happening, I would probably say that you can give this as a personal feedback that the excessive extent of bantering on the examples did not really help the cause in convincing you as an adjudicator. I think that's something that I would probably put forward as a personal feedback. Okay, Shruti, have I been able to answer your question?
Yes, yes. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome. No problem. Okay, next.
Can I ask one more question if you allow?
Yes, no problem.
Teams use wrong examples. For example, capitalism versus socialism, and the team goes ahead and gives you a wrong country's example. So, do you as a speaker
But not something absolutely detrimental that would, it shouldn't be, given that importance of a value. Okay. All right, Shruti. Okay, next. So whenever you all are using examples, and this is something that I've observed on quite a few occasions, is whenever we try to explain on example where we don't really know of example, go ahead and apply in terms of our methods. In those cases, we often try to give, relate, and connect them so that they are explained in a manner that is accessible and understandable by the adjudicator as well. So in those circumstances, you might not know about a certain country, you might not know about a certain issue that is happening, but given the context of what it is, or let's say given the context of certain degree of knowledge, I hope there isn't a case as such where you have no idea whatsoever about the topic that has been given for you to debate on. Then you are in a pretty bad mess. But other than that, I think you can definitely go ahead and draw similarity and then present your arguments on that basis. Again, it might work out, might not work out, because until unless you have a decent degree of knowledge about any specific event that is happening. For example, the Myanmar conflict. Okay, So how do conflicts go about in general? And given the nature of the motion, this is something that I was practicing with some of my students very recently, where they had to justify the economic sanctions on Myanmar. Now, you might not know in detail about what has happened in Myanmar, but over the course of time, there must have been some debate that you did on civil war or, let's say, military intervention, or with regard to how economic sanctions work and operate. So you try to draw similarity from those instances and bring them as principles or understanding or explanation to the teams. And that hopefully would help them to understand what you're trying to explain. Okay. So that's also something that I feel can be optimized whenever you're using examples. Okay. So is there any more question? You can also like refer to the explanations that I provided on the impacts. If there is any area that perhaps was unclear or you would want me to focus on a bit more, I'll be more than happy to do that as well.